She was once the delicate, picture-perfect princess of Hollywood, dazzling, admired, and the epitome of grace. But behind the glamorous image, there was a woman on the brink of breaking. A woman who would shatter every expectation, rewrite the rules, and become one of the most controversial figures in American history. From an acting career that started under the shadow of her iconic father to becoming an outspoken activist with the world watching, Jane Fonda's journey was anything but ordinary. But what turned the fragile princess into Hollywood's rebel? What drove her to risk it all and to embrace the most scandalous chapters of her life? Imagine growing up with one of Hollywood's greatest legends as your dad. Sounds glamorous, right? Not exactly. Jane Fonda wasn't raised in a world of warm hugs and bedtime stories. She grew up in the shadow of Henry Fonda, the no-nonsense, emotionally distant icon of classic cinema. Henry wasn't just famous, he was Hollywood royalty. He starred in films like The Grapes of Wrath, 12 Angry Men, and On Golden Pond. And he had that steely, all-American presence that made audiences believe he could outstare death itself. But as a father, let's just say he treated fatherhood like one of his film roles. Distant, methodical, and never-breaking character. Jane later described their relationship as cold. Henry Fonda wasn't the kind of dad who'd sit down for heart-to-hearts. He was more likely to be found brooding in silence than offering words of encouragement. He didn't do feelings. He did discipline. And Jane? She spent her entire life trying to win his approval. She once recalled, "I remember sitting on the stairs, waiting for him to come home, hoping he'd notice me. He'd walk past me without a word, and I'd think, maybe tomorrow will be the day he sees me. Maybe tomorrow I'll be enough." But that never came. It was a constant battle for her. A search for validation in a place where it never quite seemed to exist. Her mother, Frances Ford Seymour, was from high society. Elegant, beautiful, and tragically fragile. She carried secrets that would later shake Jane to her core. But at this point, Jane was just a little girl trying to make sense of a family that looked perfect on the outside, but was crumbling on the inside. When Jane was just 12 years old, her world collapsed. Her mother, Frances, was struggling with severe mental health issues and had been in and out of institutions. Then one day, she was just gone. The official story? She died of a heart attack. Only years later, when Jane was a teenager, did she uncover the devastating truth. Her mother had taken her own life while in a psychiatric hospital. And how did Jane find out? By reading about it in a magazine. Let that sink in. No one in her family had told her. Jane was shattered. Her mother had been suffering in silence, and no one had talked about it. Instead of grieving, Jane did what so many kids in dysfunctional families do. She buried the pain and tried to be perfect. She developed an eating disorder, seeking control in a world that felt chaotic. She starved herself, binged, purged, anything to silence the voice in her head that told her she wasn't enough. And then there was her father. Henry Fonda didn't sit her down to offer comfort or support. Instead, he remarried just months later, moving on with the emotional efficiency of a man changing a light bulb. Jane was left to figure it all out alone. This childhood trauma shaped everything, her confidence, her relationships, even her career. Because when you spend your whole life trying to be enough, you either break or you become Jane Fonda. Fast forward to the 60s, and Jane Fonda wasn't just making movies. She was turning heads and dropping jaws. With her bombshell looks and effortless cool, she became an instant star. But here's the thing. Jane never wanted to be just a pretty face. Sure, she lit up the screen in Barbarella.
Oh, it's sort of nice, isn't it?
That campy space-age fantasy where she pranced around in futuristic lingerie. And yes, it made her a global sex symbol. But Jane wanted more. She didn't want to be a pin-up girl. She wanted respect. So she did something radical. She reinvented herself. She left behind the fluffy eye candy roles and took on gritty, powerful performances in films like They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And Clute. And it worked.
I'm not going to be able to come back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because I just can't afford it.
Did I fail you, Bree?
Well, I mean, I've been coming here all this time, and I've been paying you all this money, and why do I still want a trick? Why do I still walk by a phone and want to pick up the phone and call?
By 1971, Jane had her first Academy Award, proving she wasn't just Henry Fonda's daughter or some sci-fi fantasy figure. She was a force of nature. And the best part? She didn't stop there. She kept pushing, choosing films that challenged her, that made statements, that shook things up. Because if Jane Fonda was going to be in Hollywood, she was going to do it her way. Jane Fonda had the world at her feet, but then she did something that split America right down the middle. One move that made half of the country cheer, and the other half want to ban her forever. It was the 1970s, and the Vietnam War was raging. Jane wasn't just standing by, she was furious. She became a full-on activist, marching in protests, speaking out, and putting her career on the line to fight for what she believed in. But then came the moment that changed everything. She flew to North Vietnam, sat on an enemy anti-aircraft gun, and smiled for a photograph. It was meant as a statement against the war, but to many Americans, it looked like outright treason. The nickname Hanoi Jane stuck. Her movies were burned, people called her a traitor, and some even called for her arrest. Jane would later say it was the biggest mistake of her life, not because she regretted speaking out against the war, but because she never intended to disrespect the soldiers fighting it. The damage was done. For years, Jane Fonda became one of the most controversial women in America. But while the backlash raged, Jane's personal life was about to take another dramatic turn. Jane Fonda's love life? Let's just say she never does anything halfway. Husband number 1. Roger Vadim, the French director who turned her into Barbarella and introduced her to a world of parties, open relationships, and Parisian excess. Fun? Definitely. Built to last? Not so much. Husband number 2, Tom Hayden, the political activist who pulled Jane into the world of protests and revolution. She supported his causes, raised millions for his work, and dove headfirst into his world. But in trying to be the perfect activist wife, she lost a little bit of herself. Passionate, yes, but ultimately unsustainable. Husband number 3, Ted Turner, the billionaire media mogul who gave Jane a life of luxury, yachts, mansions, and a relationship with the man who owned CNN. Yet, even with all that, Jane realized one important thing. She didn't need a man to define her. A wild ride, but in the end, freedom won. 3 husbands, 3 wildly different chapters. But through it all, Jane kept learning, kept evolving, and most importantly, kept choosing herself. By the early 80s, Jane had done it all. Oscar-winning actress, political activist, Hollywood royalty. But did she sit back and enjoy the fame? Absolutely not. Jane Fonda doesn't do sitting still. Instead, she did something nobody saw coming. She put on a leotard and became the queen of the fitness revolution. Here's the thing. Jane wasn't just getting into aerobics because she loved leg warmers. Though, let's be honest, she rocked them. She had battled an eating disorder for years, and fitness became her way of taking back control. So, she didn't just work out, she turned it into a global movement. Enter Jane Fonda's Workout, the VHS tape that changed everything. Not just best-selling fitness video, any video. People weren't watching Star Wars in their living rooms, they were doing squats with Jane, and it didn't stop there. She released over 20 workout videos, wrote books, and built an entire fitness empire. Women across America weren't just working out, they were becoming strong, confident, and independent. The best part? Jane Fonda single-handedly made exercise cool. She made fitness fun, accessible, and most importantly, fashionable. And let's be real, if Jane tells you to do one more rep, you do it. Jane did something shocking. She disappeared. In 1991, she announced she was retiring from acting. Just like that. No more movies, no more awards, no more red carpets. She had spent her whole life performing, on screen, in activism, even in relationships, and she was exhausted. So, she walked away. For nearly 15 years, Jane stayed out of the spotlight. She focused on herself. She explored spirituality, reevaluated her past, and, after divorcing Ted Turner, found out who she really was without a man by her side. During this time, she also began digging deep into her childhood trauma, opening up about her struggles with self-worth, eating disorders, and perfectionism. She even started therapy, something she never thought she'd do. And honestly, this break might have been the best thing she ever did, because when Jane Fonda finally returned, she was stronger, wiser, and more powerful than ever. If you thought Jane Fonda was done with Hollywood, think again. The 2000s arrived, and so did Jane, ready to remind the world exactly who she was. Her official return? The 2005 movie Monster-in-Law starring opposite Jennifer Lopez. And let's be clear, J.Lo may have been the star, but Jane stole the show. The world remembered why they loved her. And just like that, Jane Fonda was back.
Take off that white dress right now, or I'll take it off for you.
Don't you tell me what to do!
You did not just poke me!
Don't you touch me, you two-bit tramp! Oh!
Oh my God! Viola, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to.
But her real comeback? That came in 2015 with Grace and Frankie. Jane, along with her lifelong friend Lily Tomlin, it was fresh, hilarious, and exactly what the world needed.
I am not responsible. Stop dancing.
I didn't realize I was.
I did everything right, Lord. I stood by him for over 40 years. I raised his children. I shopped with his mother.
And it wasn't just funny, it was groundbreaking. A series led by two women over 70 in Hollywood, that's rarer than a pearl in an oyster. But Jane didn't just do the show, she owned it, and fans couldn't get enough. Suddenly, young people were binge-watching Grace and Frankie, turning Jane into a whole new kind of icon. It was official. Jane Fonda had mastered the art of the comeback. Most people, by the time they hit their 70s, are thinking about retirement, vacations, and taking it easy. Jane Fonda, she was getting arrested. Yep, in her 80s, Jane became the face of climate activism. She launched Fire Drill Fridays, a series of protests in Washington, D.C., demanding action against climate change. And when Jane protests, she goes all in.
And I'm so grateful. Don't stop, and we won't stop either. Thank you.
If we continued...
She got arrested 5 times in 2019 alone.
Well, Jane, you've been arrested how many times over the last few months? I'm curious about this.
5.
5 times over the last few months.
Wearing her now iconic red coat, she marched, gave speeches, and got handcuffed alongside young activists half her age. And let's be real, Jane getting arrested at 81 years old was probably cooler than most people in their 20s posting about activism on Instagram. But Jane doesn't just talk about justice, she lives it. She's fought for women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, racial justice, because for Jane Fonda, activism isn't a phase, it's who she is. So, what does Jane Fonda's final act look like? Simple. She's living her best life. She's embracing aging. No shame, no fear, just wisdom and confidence. She's still working, still speaking out, and yes, still working out, because once a fitness queen, always a fitness queen. She openly talks about what it's like to be in her 80s, the good, the bad, and the hilarious. She's ditched perfection, let go of past regrets, and focused on being happy. And most importantly, she's still inspiring people. Jane Fonda didn't just survive Hollywood, she rewrote the rules. She's lived through tragedy, reinvention, controversy, and 3 marriages. And through it all, she's come out stronger, wiser, and funnier than ever. So if there's one lesson to take from Jane's journey, it's this. You are never too old, too broken, or too far gone to reinvent yourself. And that is why Jane Fonda is more than a Hollywood legend. She's a life legend. So what do you think? Jane Fonda has lived 1,000 lives. Hollywood royalty, controversial activist, fitness queen, and comeback legend. But which version of Jane inspires you the most? Is it the fearless actress who won Oscars and stole every scene? The fitness icon who made millions of people fall in love with exercise? Or the unstoppable force who's still getting arrested in her 80s for what she believes in? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Jane's incredible life, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because trust me, there's always more Hollywood legends to uncover.